everybody. Welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 12th. And I post a little bit later today because I also teach a face-to-face version of this class, and I wanted to see how far we would get. And as I suspected, it took us a little bit longer than it would take you as an online class to get through both the film Citizen Kane and Roger Ebert's analysis of Citizen Kane. So basically, what I wanted to do was just to talk a little bit about Citizen Kane today. There won't be a discussion forum response. And then what we can do is both classes will be on the same schedule, and then we will continue on from there. Basically, as you know, Citizen Kane is oftentimes ranked as perhaps the best film ever made. And certainly that's what Roger Ebert thinks, and I suspect that I think the same as well. Every time I see Citizen Kane, I always find something new and interesting about that particular film. The cinematography, what they were able to do with cameras. Deep focus photography is just one example that Roger Ebert talked quite a bit about. The idea of having everything in focus in the shot, the background as well as the foreground, which was very difficult because they just didn't have the technology that we've got today. Remember, this film was made in 1941. The musical score. And the score, in some ways, is just as good as the film. Think about, for instance, the song that's sung when Kane is in the newsroom with his colleagues, the song that was written for him about being basically known as an important individual in society, but still being humble. And of course, that's the exact opposite of the Kane that we know, that as by that point in the film, Kane obviously has ego, and that ego just continues to grow over the course of the film. The special effects, which Robert Ebert talked about as well, or Roger Ebert talked about as well, the idea that so much of it is invisible, but the techniques used at the time, for instance, matte drawings in order to simulate real sets, and the complex dissolves and fades were revolutionary, really, for the time period and still hold up after all of these years. The lighting is one of the reasons why this film was able to achieve those kinds of special effects and cinematography. And the black and white film stock obviously lends itself to the idea of shadows, and Orson Welles used shadows wonderfully. This idea of mirror images and reflections. The entire film basically is a series of reflections of individuals. What we're told at the very beginning with the opening shot, no trespassing, because of course the irony is that we will spend the rest of the film trying to trespass. And then the closing shot of no trespassing, that basically we've learned very little through the revelation of what Rosebud means. Of course, Rosebud is a symbol, and there are many literary elements to this particular play, that Rosebud represents Kane's lost childhood and his search for love, which he spends the entire film looking for. One of the many messages of the film is that money can't buy love, although Kane tries. The acting. And Orson Welles served as the main character, as well as the director, as well as the co-screenwriter. And keep in mind, he was just in his early 20s. It was really remarkable what he was able to do. But one of the marvels of the acting involved the makeup, that we've got aging characters. Again, something that we take for granted, but at the time, the makeup techniques weren't as advanced as our makeup techniques. So that too was one of the great pieces of the film, not just the actors acting as if they had aged, but having makeup enough that was convincing enough to illustrate aging. The directing, of course, this was all Orson Welles' vision, and it's never easy to direct when you're also acting. Oftentimes it's a mistake, but in this film, I think it was anything but. The writing and all of the literary elements associated with this film. Rosebud perhaps being the most famous literary term in film history. But just think about the way that gender for instance, is portrayed in the film. Just think about the way that symbolism is portrayed in the film through visuals as well as through script writing. There's a reason why the character of Cain is always hungry, where he says at one point at the newspaper, "I'm starving." And that illustrates his emotional hunger. When we have visuals such as Susan Alexander after her suicide attempt being framed by shadows that look like prison bars, again, Roger Ebert talked a little bit about this, the idea that she is felt in prison. I thought Roger Ebert's commentary about the cockatoo was interesting, where he had said that it was basically an error. If you know anything about the director Fellini, it seemed very Fellini-esque. However, I think that bird imagery works well in this film. So even if it was an error, it was a happy error, in that ultimately, if you'll remember at the beginning, Citizen Kane was using shadow play in order to impress Susan Alexander, and he was trying to mimic a rooster or a kind of bird, and now we've got a cockatoo, another kind of bird. Birds oftentimes used to represent female, and also birds, I think, can be used to signify entrapment or freedom, and all of those are themes within. So another happy mistake that Roger Ebert discussed is during the scene where Jeb is drunk, he mispronounces a word and he says crematism rather than criticism because he was so tired with his shooting schedule for other projects. And if you look very carefully at the film, you'll be able to see Orson Welles's eyes light up. And this basically was an unplanned moment that they decided to leave in the film. They didn't call cut, and that would have been Orson Welles's decision. And it worked just so nicely for the scene because it made the actor, Leland, seem much more drunk than perhaps his own acting could have done with if he had been fresh. And that said, in the scene where Orson Welles is tearing apart his room, I personally think that he should have allowed the camera to record his injury because Roger Ebert had talked about that he had cut his hand when he was doing it. I think it would have worked wonderfully in terms of the plot and the theme, but Orson Welles made the decision to try to hide that from the audience. Set design, and Roger Ebert talked about how often that the set designs basically had very little in them, but they utilized our imagination and they utilized sound effects like echo chambers to make things seem much more grandiose. The sounds, again, thinking about echo chambers or sound effects like a typewriter punctuating the "you're fired" after Leland is fired. Orson Welles very familiar with this through his radio days. The pacing, and that strikes me as well, that by the time that we see that cockatoo, it sort of startles us into paying attention at a time where we might be drifting off. The costuming. So something as simple, for instance, as Kane wearing a white suit when he announces his engagement to his first wife. You know, he's filled with a lot of hope and optimism, and Kane will be wearing darker colors as the film progresses, illustrating his aging. So irony, and there's a good amount of irony in that it turns out that Orson Welles' life became very similar to Citizen Kane's life. If you watch the documentary that I had shown clips of in class, you'll learn a little bit more about Orson Welles' life. The ending of his career was rather sad. He became morbidly obese, so much so that he oftentimes had to travel via wheelchair, and he had to take bit parts in television commercials selling things like cheap wine. That's what became of The Boy Genius. So William Randolph Hearst was successful in destroying Orson Welles' career, but he was not successful in destroying the film, luckily, and we have the film now as evidence. And you'll note that I included a link to the film And certainly you can stream the film. The film is on reserve in the GCC library. The film version that I show in class is high def with closed captions. So a free link online may not necessarily have those options, but at least it's something. And certainly if you decide that you want to write your first paper about Citizen Kane, which is something we'll be discussing in greater depth next class, then you definitely want to have multiple viewings of the film. But at this point, you should have had 2 viewings of the film. The first just to experience it as a film, and the second with listening and watching Roger Ebert's commentary about the film. So you can have some examples about how to go about doing some film analysis. You probably have some experience with doing literary analysis because you've probably examined literature in other English classes, but you may not have examined film. So I wanted you to have that particular experience. So, what I'm going to talk about next class, I'm just going to put some closure onto Citizen Kane, and then we'll talk a little bit about that first paper. Now that we have completed our first film, we have the opportunity of writing about that film, but we also have quite a few short stories that will be coming up. So we are going to transition from film into literature, trying to talk about what makes a great piece of literature, how do we evaluate quality, and read some representative pieces of short story for us in our fiction section, just because we don't have the time to read a novel in its entirety. And what you will see is that I was able to find the links for these short stories online. And that said, I'm including that below in our Moodle site. But of course, you can access these works, or most of them, in the newest edition of our textbook. And ironically, in some of the older editions, you might even find more of the works available. And when a work is not included in the textbook, I will, of course, include the link for you. I also have a link of a sample of the textbook that we're using, the Compact Bedford Introduction to Literature in the latest edition. And of course, that said, it's not available in its entirety, but at least that gives you the opportunity to take a peek. So as I said at the start of this, I'm going to keep it short and not have this class be too far ahead from my face-to-face class. So I'm going to just stop this here, and there will be no attendance question for today. You're welcome. And then what we will do is next class, we will put some closure onto Citizen Kane, and we will, of course, talk about short story. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.